I didn't get out of jail till 5 or 6 the next afternoon. And that was basically we weren't charged. We were held on we were detained on the grounds of quote-unquote breach of peace, which is not a criminal offense. And the conditions in jail, I mean, I've been working from the Middle East as a journalist for the past 3 years or so, since 2007. And the jails actually remind me a lot more of the ones I've seen that Israelis hold for Palestinians or the Palestinian Authority holds. We were in handcuffs, or at least I was in handcuffs till nearly 5 in the morning while being processed in different cells and waiting to be processed. And in cells of overcrowded cells of over 20 people with a porta potty, very limited access to water. Then after I was processed, I was moved to a 5-foot by 8-foot cell where there were 5 other people with me. And there was no benches, no washroom, only a concrete floor, and the room was absolutely freezing, not even enough space for us to lie down and sleep all at the same time. It was incredibly difficult to sleep because it was so cold. A lot of the people I was in jail with had been beaten and beaten quite badly. Black eyes, bloody noses, had been hit all over. And also a lot of the people, there were several people from the Alternative Media Center who had been taken in for just doing their job, which was reporting from the front lines.
That was Jesse Rosenfeld, freelance reporter on assignment with the Guardian newspaper in London. He was also a journalist with the Alternative Media Center, arrested and detained by the Canadian police on Saturday evening. Naomi Klein, the level of force that was used, the money that has been put into this, and then I want to end with the Gulf of Mexico, from the G20 to the Gulf of Mexico, and there are connections. I think you make them when you speak and when you write, when we're talking about the power of corporations.
Well, we'll see if we make it to the Gulf of Mexico, Amy. But I want to talk a little bit about that horrifying story from Jesse, and there are many others like it, and the police rioted after what happened on Saturday. As you mentioned at the top of the show, more than 600 people have been arrested, brutally arrested in many cases. These nighttime raids, there are stories of people waking up with guns pointed in their faces. And the context for this is really frightening, because the police are feeling really cornered and feeling like they have to justify something which is completely unjustifiable. And that is the price tag that they put on what it would cost to provide security for the G8 and G20 summit. Security for this summit cost, as you mentioned, an estimated $1 billion. Just to put that in perspective, it's more than security has ever cost for any summit ever in the world. Canada is not a country which has a history of terrorist attacks. So it isn't at all clear why they felt they needed to spend such a huge amount of money. As a point of comparison, at the Pittsburgh G20 summit, the price tag for security was $100 million. So you went in less than a year from $100 million price tag to $1 billion price tag for security with no explanation. And as Canadians started to learn about this, they became rightfully very, very angry. And the police were under a lot of pressure to explain why they were treating this summit that Canada was hosting essentially as a cash grab. Basically what happened is they were able to buy all kinds of new toys, water cannons, sound cannons, all kinds of high-tech stuff. But the real cash grab was overtime pay for the police. I mean, they were absolutely extravagant in their overtime demands, unyielding. They said, if you want security, this is what it costs. So before the summit started, there was a public opinion poll that was conducted that found that 78% of Canadians believed that the cost was unjustified. So what happened on Saturday when you saw those burning cop cars and windows breaking was what I can only describe as a cop strike. Essentially, they were just letting it happen. And people were watching this, not understanding why for hours, the same police car was just allowed to burn. I mean, these guys had just bought themselves a brand new water cannon, and yet they couldn't seem to find themselves a fire extinguisher. Now, while that was happening, media outlets were getting press statements, and I'll just read you one. This is from the Toronto Police Department. All you have to do is turn on the TV and see what's happening now. Police cars are getting torched. Buildings are being vandalized. People are getting beat up. And so the so-called intimidating police presence is essential to restoring order. In other words, the police were playing public relations overtly. They were saying, okay, you're telling us our price tag was too high. We're getting in political trouble for our outrageous demands. So now we're going to show you this huge threat that we're up against. And so we had a police commissioner named Julian Fantino who's now started to talk about activists as organized crime. He says it's not enough to call them thugs, they're organized criminals. So what's dangerous here is that in order to justify their own unjustifiable actions, they need to overinflate a threat. And so that has played itself out in two ways. One, by allowing what happened on Saturday to happen with almost no intervention. And then that was stage one. And stage two was using that inaction as the justification for scooping up hundreds of other activists, beating up journalists, just going on a rampage. Now, if they were serious about getting the people who'd broken the windows, they would have done the arrests there at the time. But that's not what they've done. They went to other parts of the city. They waited hours, and that's who they arrested. So I feel very, very worried about my friends who are in jail right now because I think there's nothing more frightening than a police force that feels the need to justify itself in this way and using these young activists as their political cover. And I think it's a very dangerous situation, Amy.
Naomi, we just have a minute, but I would like you to touch on, since you were in the Gulf, and because the G20 is not as much about containing corporate power, but it seems to be augmenting and protecting it. What you see is the connection from the Gulf to Toronto.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do have a long piece about the oil disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. It's the cover story in The Nation this week. If people want to read it, it's called "The Hole in the World," and I won't try to summarize it here. But to me, and this is what I spoke about in Toronto, one of the most important messages that we really need to learn in this moment is if we are going to oppose the strategy that these G20 leaders have just put on the table for how to deal with the budget crisis that they created, if we're going to say we don't want to get stuck with the bill for your crisis, then we have to put other revenue sources on the table. And that means cutting military and police spending, like the outrageous police spending we just saw in Toronto, but much larger than that, the losing wars that we're fighting. That's a great cost saver. And also taxing the banks, financial transaction taxes, but also going after the fossil fuel companies. Because the message that we need to learn from the BP disaster, this is just the incredible costs imposed on societies by this industry. It is not just BP. And we've accepted the principle in the Gulf of Mexico, or most of us have, with the exception of some Republicans, that the polluter should pay. And I think what we need to do is extend that principle so that paying around the world. So Shell is paying for the environmental devastation it has wrought in Ogoniland, in Nigeria, and the decimation of the Niger Delta. And Chevron is paying for what its predecessor, Texaco, did in the Amazon and what's called the Amazonian Chernobyl, in a case I know that you've covered extensively on Democracy Now! And on that is the issue of what the whole fossil fuel industry has done in terms of sticking us with the bill for climate change, the cost of adapting to climate change, but also the cost of shifting away from fossil fuels. And one of the things that we just heard at the G20 summit is that the leaders don't believe that they can afford to take real action on climate change. Any action on climate change, according to the G20 has to ensure economic growth, which basically means they can't take any action on climate change. So I think we need to very forcefully put on the table, we do need to take action on climate change. And if our governments have a cash flow problem, then they should be going directly after the fossil fuel companies, and they should pay for it because they created the crisis, they created the problem, and the polluter should pay.
Naomi Klein, I want to thank you very much for being with us. Journalist and author. Her latest book, The